Okay. What street is that now? Is that East Genesee or?
East Washington Street.
East Washington,
Yes,
okay.
yes.
All right. All right. Good. I learned something. So there's a, what is that? There's a picture of Abe Lincoln's funeral going through the Syracuse. So, okay. Everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. First ladies. First ladies at first were called Presidentress or Mrs. President. And most of them came from a high social and economic background. Unlike their husbands, who did not come from well, many of the first ladies' families opposed them marrying the man they married because they didn't have prestige, they didn't have status. There were no specific duties for the first ladies, but many of them had public receptions that started very early, where the public reception would be, you would go by to meet the president on New Year's Day. It was wherever the president lived. First it started in New York. People would get in line on New Year's Day to meet the president and the first lady. And that tradition carried for a long time. And it's that most first ladies did not exercise influence over their husband. It said the first lady that did the most influence over her husband was Betty Ford. She urged Gerald Ford to pardon Richard Nixon because she didn't want to see a president going to jail. Turn up the microphone.
It's turning so that the mic is actually going away.
Front there, it comes.
Okay.
Open your eyes.
Better or worse? Am I okay? Help. So, Betty Ford was behind Richard Nixon's pardon. Martha Washington, George had good taste. Martha was the wealthiest woman in Virginia. How's that, guys, huh? Good taste, marrying the richest woman in the state. And Martha used to accompany George to the battlefields. You never heard about that. She went to the battlefields with him. She would nurse the ill, help the injured. She would try to keep up their spirits, and she would often prepare food and do things like that for them. Martha was the first person, not the first woman, but the first person that would be on a postage stamp. Martha Washington. And she began the practice of people being able to meet the President of the United States on New Year's Day. She was the one who started that. She was 26 when George Washington proposed to her, and the first time she turned him down. And you find there's a trend here in that. Abigail Adams, her and John Adams were married 54 years. They met when she was 14, and they married years later. And John Adams often wrote, "I could do nothing without you." And they liked dancing and playing cards and exchanging poetry. And Abigail Adams was the first person to have a husband and a son be president of the United States. She was the first. Martha Jefferson was a widow before she met Thomas Jefferson, and she ended up dying before he became president of the United States. And you're going to hear many sad stories in here that our First Lady's experienced. Martha Jefferson and Thomas often performed duets together. They would like to go to gatherings like this, and they would sing together. They were married 10 years before she passed away. And then when she passed, her husband Thomas remained in seclusion for 3 months. He was so depressed. And when she wasn't able to perform the duties as First Lady, he got a woman named Dolly Madison to do the duties of First Ladies. And then when President Madison became president, of course the First Lady was Dolly. And she was 20 years younger than her husband and a very sociable person. She set up the first inaugural ball in Washington. There was Dolly Madison. And she also had the introduction of a very important item. She made the first ice cream. Dolly Madison, and she used the recipe that Thomas Jefferson had. And she actually made it. Elizabeth Monroe, they had 3 children, and she was criticized because her official portrait had new fashions, and it was showing more of her arm and some of her upper chest. And that was a no-no. They heavily criticized her for that. Lisa Adams, she was the first lady to be born outside of the United States. And the second one is Melania Trump. Yep. Okay. Louise Adams. She spoke French fluently, and she wrote essays, poems, and plays. Rachel Jackson. She left her abusive husband, filed for a divorce, supposedly married Andrew Jackson, and later her ex heard that she married Andrew Jackson, and he knew that the divorce papers were never processed. So it broke out in a scandal, and Andrew Jackson was going out getting in fights, trying to defend his wife's reputation, living with him and being married to some other man. So Andrew Jackson would be out getting in fights over that. Hannah Van Buren, they had 5 children, and she died at age 35 of tuberculosis. So she died before he became the president. Van Buren never remarried, and his son's wife was the first lady, and she had help from a lady named Dolly Madison. Then there's Ian Stymies, who married William Henry Harrison. Both of her parents were opposed to these young lovers getting married, but it must have been a successful marriage because they had 9 children. And their son Scott made history because he's the only man whose father and son both became president of the United States. So there was Scott Harrison. He had both of them. Letita Tyler, they had 8 children, and she died during his first term as president. So he eloped. The president eloped with a lady named Julia Gardner, who was 30 years younger than him. So get your math straight here. By his first wife, he had 8 children. 8 children before she died. So he marries his second wife. She was 24, and they had 7 children. So now we got 15 children in the White House. So I guess our taxpayers were buying their clothes and their food and stuff. I don't know. So that was the Tylers, 15. Sarah Polk, they got married on New Year's Day in 1824. Sarah Polk for religious reasons, forbade alcohol, card playing, and dancing in the White House. And she even forbade her husband, James Polk. Now, listen to this, guys. You're President of the United States. Your wife says you cannot go to horse races. He couldn't go. The most important man in the world wasn't allowed to go to horse races because of his wife. And Sarah also received First Lady guidance from a lady named Dolly Madison. Margaret Taylor, they had 6 children. 2 daughters died by rapidly spreading fever in 1820. And you will find here many First Ladies lost their children young because of all the illnesses at the time. You got yellow fever and all those things. And one of her daughters married Confederate President Jefferson Davis. So they did not go to the wedding because they opposed it. And Margaret Taylor had very low visibility as First Lady. She liked to knit and smoke her pipe. Margaret Taylor smoked a pipe. Abigail Fillmore, they married 7 years after they met, and she forbade smoking and drinking in the White House. She was the first presidential First Lady to have ever worked before she became First Lady. She was a school teacher. Jane Pierce, her courtship lasted 10 years, and her family opposed her marriage because her husband, who became President Pierce, he came from low wealth and prestige. So that was important. They had a sad life. They had 3 children, but none of them lived to adulthood. And the Pierces saw one of their children, one of their sons, get killed by a train right in front of them. And apparently she did not really recover from that. She was always very depressed. She even did not speak out on her women's issues when they were trying to get her to take a stand on the first convention in Seneca Falls, which isn't that far from here. They wanted her to take a stand on it, and she won. James Buchanan, he was the only president never to be married. He had a fiancée named Ann Coleman. And Ann Coleman died before they got married. And her parents blamed her death on him, and wouldn't even allow him to attend his fiancée's funeral. Mary Todd Lincoln, she lost her mother at age 7. While her mother was giving birth to some other child. And when her brother met Abe Lincoln, he gave her a tough time not to marry Abe because Abe was rough and lacked social graces. So he opposed her getting married to Abe Lincoln. And she also went out with Jefferson Davis, who later became her husband's opponent. They used to Jefferson married Abe Lincoln, married in 1840. They were supposed to get married in 1840, but Abe Lincoln failed to show up. Yeah, they reconciled and married 2 years later. They lost 2 children at a premature birth. And you hear a lot of these comparisons about the Kennedys and Lincolns. One of the comparisons, that each lost two children at birth. They had one other son die in 1862 of typhoid fever, and they only had one child who lived to adulthood. And we've heard about Mrs. Lincoln having emotional problems. Well, in this book I read, her husband, of course, was commander of the armed forces in the North. She was from Kentucky, and her father and brothers were fighting for the South. So they're fighting against each other, trying to kill each other. I guess that'd drive anybody a little emotionally weak. Elisa Johnson never married when he was 19 and she was 17. And Mrs. Johnson taught her husband how to read, write, and do arithmetic. So here's a man who became president, and obviously he wouldn't have been if his wife hadn't taught him how to read, and write, and do arithmetic. It was Mrs. Johnson. Julia Grant, she changed the role of the First Lady. In the 8 years she was in, she traveled throughout the United States, and she even went overseas. And she had regular press conferences, and she spoke her points of view on issues. It was pretty bold for a First Lady at that time to be doing that herself. Her family owned slaves during the Civil War when her husband was a general in the Northern Army. Previously, Grant's anti-slavery policy, family refused to attend Grant's funeral because her father was a slave owner. So the Grant family wouldn't go to the wedding because her father owned slaves. The press often commented on Mrs. Grant's dress, her appearance. Her reviews were often unfavorable. They did not like her dresses, her appearance. She was overweight, and they said she should have a better clothes selection. Lucy Hayes, they met when they were 14, but they did not date until she graduated from college. They were married 50 years. Lucy Hayes was a smart and witty woman, and she refused to serve alcohol in the White House. And that's how she earned the name Lemonade Lucy. First Lady. And she used to sew clothes for soldiers, and she had a reputation of other soldiers bringing her clothes to sew for them, and she did. She was always sewing the clothes. She was very outspoken on an issue of equal pay. Women should make as much as men. Wow, what was that, 1800, something like that? We're still fighting over it. And she was the first lady to have the egg roll contest at the White House. Lucretia Garfield, they were childhood friends and attended school together. They had 8 children. They had a daughter die of diphtheria. And she was a very good public speaker, better speaker than her husband. And she was a school teacher. Ellen Arthur, they loved each other deeply. They had 3 children. Their marriage lasted 20 years. Then she caught a cold and died of pneumonia. And she died 1 year before he became president of the United States. We've had 5 presidents whose wives died before they got into the White House. But Ellen Arthur was not forgotten. Her husband was president. He placed fresh flowers on her portrait in the White House every morning. So he did not forget her. Frances Cleveland. She was only 21 when she became First Lady. She graduated from Wells College, which isn't very far from here. She was the youngest first lady ever. She was the second president, Cleveland was the second president to marry in the White House. And they had 2 receptions a week to meet the public. And at one time, they had over 8,000 people at a reception. So now they're having these receptions twice a week where people are getting in line to meet the president of the United States. So they were in the White House. They ran for re-election and lost. Harrison won. And when Mrs. Cleveland was leaving the White House, she told the staff, do not take down the curtains or change the furniture because we'll be back in 4 years. And they were. Only president in history to run again and be re-elected. Mrs. Cleveland also, when she came back, she had 1 daughter when they came back. When they got in the White House the second time, she had a second daughter, and they named the daughter Ruth. And the press used to call her Ruth, Baby Ruth, and Sweet Baby Ruth. And that's when a woman had a smart idea, is I'm going to create a sweet candy bar and call it Baby Ruth. And that's where the Baby Ruth candy bar came from. Grover Cleveland's daughter named Ruth. We all think it was a baseball player. It wasn't. And then they had two sons. The Harrisons, who were president in between them, they had 3 children. And at that time, the place was still being called the Presidential Palace. It wasn't called the White House until Teddy Roosevelt came in. Caroline Harrison was the first lady to have a Christmas tree in the White House. And when her husband was president, she was in charge of installing the electricity in the White House. Well, when the president went to turn off the electricity, he got a shock going to bed. Turn off the lights and he got a shock. And all while he was in the White House, he never turned off the lights after that. And at that time, I can't say they blamed him, but she was in charge of installing the electricity in the White House. She had the first Christmas tree with lights on it. Ida McKinley, they had an extravagant wedding ceremony, had over 1,000 people. They had 2 daughters who both died at birth. And one died at birth and one died later of typhoid fever. And she really never recovered from the mom. Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt proposed to a woman named Edith Carroll. She refused to marry him. So he then asked this lady Alice to marry him. Alice married Teddy Roosevelt. Alice died 4 years later. Then Teddy became mayor of New York City. He went back to Edith Carroll, asked her to marry him, and this time she accepted. So, and he was the fifth person. He was the 5th one to have his first lady die either before or while he was in the White House. So 2 years after his wife died, he married Edith Carroll, whom he remained married to for the rest of his life. And she continued the New Year's resolution of welcoming people to the White House. Now she had 8,538 people come through the White House to meet the President of the United States. And she assembled and saved and started the White House China collection. She put them all in organized, saved previous presidents, China and Rome. And the tradition continues. If you go down to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, you can see them. They have all of them there. Helen Taft. Helen Taft was called Nellie. She rejected her husband's first two proposals. She finally accepted the third. She was behind Teddy Roosevelt selecting her husband to be the vice president. The president to pick Teddy Roosevelt is the VP at that time. Helen Taft, when she was a child, her father and grandfather were both in Congress. And she visited the White House and says, someday I want to return here for a longer stay. And she did. Her husband said that when he was president, she was still the politician of the family, not him. And she was the first presidential wife to ride in an inaugural parade. It must have been one of those cars. And she was the first lady, Mrs. Taft, the first lady to smoke cigarettes. Boy, bad PR, huh? Ellen Wilson, she served as the first lady for approximately 1 year, and she died of kidney failure. But Ellen Wilson also oversaw the implementation of the first Mother's Day. Mrs. Wilson, she gave us that. After a year, President Wilson married Edith Gauck, and a year after that, he had a stroke, and it's widely published that she made many decisions running the country when he was suffering from a stroke. Mabel Harding, she was a piano teacher. Florence was 5 years older than her husband. She had a daughter, and she was the first lady to vote. That's Mabel Harding. They did not have any children together, but Harding had 2 children by other women when he was in the White House. And it didn't come out until after his death, and she tried to keep it quiet too, to protect her husband. And he died in his 3rd year in office, and some says she poisoned him. So be careful, men. But it didn't come out after he died, both those affairs. Lou Hoover, they met at Stanford, where she became the first woman in the United States to earn a degree in geology. And she was president of the Girl Scouts of America, League of Women Voters, and the Women's National Athletic Association. She spoke Chinese fluently, and when the Hoovers used to fight in the White House, they would fight in Chinese, and nobody could understand what they were saying. Good philosophy. Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt lost her mother as a child. She had to help raise her younger brother, and she used to wear her mother's clothes, and she didn't take care of herself. And even when she was in her teens, people were calling her unattractive granny. She's still in her teens, and that really affected her. Her father's brother, which was her uncle, was a man named Teddy Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt's father died the day she was going to get married. so she had Uncle Teddy Roosevelt walk her down the aisle. Eleanor Roosevelt had regular press conferences. She had 348 press conferences as First Lady. She invited women-only reporters and prohibited news services that did not have any women reporters. I can certainly understand that from that time. A lot of them just had male reporters and she wouldn't invite them. She wrote a daily newspaper column, a monthly magazine, and hosted a weekly radio show called My Day. And one other thing about Mrs. Roosevelt, she encouraged her husband to appoint a woman to the cabinet. And he appointed a woman named Frances Perkins. And Frances Perkins ended up writing a law called, you may have heard of it, First Lady talked to President to hire a woman Secretary of Labor, and that first woman cabinet member wrote a bill called Social Security. You may have heard of it, Social Security. It came from a woman. And she brought it to the president, and he said, well, I'll be attacked for it, but he says, I agree with it, and I will support it and approve it. Mrs. Roosevelt also found out, opening her husband's mail, that he was having an affair. And she kept it quiet. She inspected mines. She actually went down to the mines. She visited slums, and she interviewed families in the poor neighborhoods. She was referred to as the First Lady of the World. It was Mrs. Roosevelt. Harry and Bess Truman met. He was 6 and she was 5. They met in Sunday school. He asked her to marry her 3 times before she accepted. You can see that trend here. Harry carried Bess's picture in his pocket during the war, praying that he would return to her, and he did. And he became president. She became First Lady. She visited royalty throughout the world. Newsmen all agree that Trumans were the closest family ever in the White House. They retired to the retirement home built by Bess's grandfather. She lived at age 97, which is the oldest of any First Lady that she had lived. Mamie Eisenhower, they met, she was 19, they had 2 children. She was 19 when they got married. They had 2 children. One died at age 3. One more sad story. The other child lived to adulthood. During Eisenhower's military service, they relocated 27 times in 37 years. And again, she found out that her husband was seeing somebody else on the side. Mamie suffered from heart and respiratory problems as a good part of her life. And in 1966, they did celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary. The only couple to do so other than John Quincy Adams and his wife. Jackie Kennedy, most of you certainly remember a lot of things about her, but she won an Emmy for her first TV tour of the restoration of the White House. She was responsible for relocating and having many of the historical items and furniture returned to the White House. She was also voted Woman of the Year in 1961, more than 100 international periodicals, 100 of them in the world, in 1961. And when Jackie left the White House, she was only 33 years old. It's hard to believe that we had a former First Lady at age 33. Lady Bird Johnson, her parents supported the marriage the only one I found in my research that supported the marriage. She delivered her own political speeches. She advocated for federal funding for American highway systems and planting trees and wildfires. She lived to age 95. Pat Nixon, Richard Nixon proposed to her their very first night they met. Wow. He married 2 years later. They had 2 daughters, and during World War II, Mrs. Nixon worked for the Red Cross. When her husband was president, she openly gave her views on women's issues. She pushed her husband to support women for the Supreme Court. And Pat Nixon was the first lady to wear pants in the White House. Boy, was that being bold, huh? A woman wearing pants in the White House? Pat Nixon. Wow, how times have changed, huh? Whoa. Betty Ford, they had a courtship. It only lasted a few months before Gerald proposed to her. In the 1940s, they both worked as a fashion model. He was late for their wedding, which was a painful experience for her all through her life, because she was second to his work. He was late for the wedding because he was giving a campaign appearance. Her and her successor, Rosalynn Carter, both fought on women's issues and, again, equal rights, equal pay for women. Betty Ford, very well known for openly discussing her battle with breast cancer. She pushed for mammograms, testing, getting cancer at early stages. She publicly talked about the surgery and radiation options, and she was behind the finding of the Women's Betty Ford Center in Palm Springs, California. She was also behind an alcohol and drug treatment center being found. Because when she was fighting her cancer, she got hooked on drugs and found out that had difficulty being hung up on alcohol and drugs, and she formed a treatment center. Rosalynn Carter, she was 18 when Jimmy Carter proposed to her, and she refused. 2 months later, she accepted. They did have 4 children. Only one was in the White House. The other 3 were older. She didn't like the idea when she was first lady that the press was talking about her dress and her shopping for clothes. They wanted the press to talk about the issues that she was talking about and not what she was wearing, but she couldn't get away from that. And to this day, Jimmy Carter and Rosalynn Carter work together in Habitat for Humanity, building houses. I think they're 93, and they're still out there working every day, building houses. That's amazing. Nancy Reagan, as First Lady, she was a supporter of the foster grandparents program for kids who didn't have parents or maybe didn't have any grandparents. And she did a rock and roll video that said, "Just say no to drugs." And that was something that she did extensively in the White House, was to fight drugs. Barbara Bush, she met George when she was 16. George proposed to her when she was 17. She said she married the first man she ever kissed. You may have heard that because she just passed away last month. Their marriage was delayed by World War II. And they got married the year the war ended. They had 5 children. They lost a daughter named Robin in 1953 to leukemia. She was the second woman in history to have a husband and a son both become president of the United States. Like Bess Truman, she kept her political opinions to herself. She didn't want to interfere with anything her husband was saying or doing. Hillary Clinton, we know she was the first lady to run for the Senate and win and be Secretary of State and run for president. When Hillary Clinton was 16, she wrote NASA and says, "How can a woman become an astronaut?" They wrote it back and says, "We do not allow women to be astronauts." Well, that's when Hillary was 16. So since then, we've had several women in space. We've had, I think Sally Ride was the first one in space. We had a woman who graduated from Syracuse University, was the first woman who was in charge of space flight. We've had women up in space, in the space thing up there for months and months at a time. So, interesting how times have changed. There were advantages for women and not allowed to go to space. Laura Bush was the first lady to give birth, or the only first lady ever to give birth to twins. And she is known for launching the American National Book Festival. She promoted literacy throughout the world and opposed the oppression of women in Afghanistan and other countries where they couldn't vote, they couldn't drive, and she started the movement to change our votes. Michelle Obama, one of the most popular first ladies. She was the first African-American first lady. She fought child obesity and the Let's Move exercise program for children. Because when we were young, we used to walk to school. Kids these days to walk down the end of the driveway, they get on the bus and go to school. So we wonder why the roadway, plus the fast food. So Mr. Obama was fighting that, supporting healthy eating and encouraging people to plant gardens and eat food out of the garden. Melania Trump, she had a press conference this afternoon. You can check on the news about that. She was the second first lady to be born in a foreign country. She was Slovenian. She graduated from the College of Jubania. I think I said that right. She was a model. She was Miss USA in 2003. And then she started acting on a show called The Apprentice in 2004. And I think we know most of the rest of the story. And she hopes to educate youth against bullying, which was what she talked about at her press conference this afternoon. And she's also following through with some things that Mrs. Obama started about fighting child obesity and support healthy eating. So there's the first ladies, and I'll comment here on two other ladies in history. 1872, Susan B. Anthony, dressed up as a man, and she went and voted. She got arrested, she got put in jail, they fined her $100. It was a big public outcry that a woman was in jail for voting. So they let her out of jail, fined her $100, and which was a lot of money in 1872, and she never paid the fine. She began the movement to give women the right to vote. There's a lot of localities, because of her, started allowing women to vote. Some cities, towns, counties, and maybe some states started allowing women to vote. And it didn't become national law for about 30 years later. The last story is about Rosa Parks. We know who she is. She got on the bus. She wouldn't give up her seat. She went and moved to the back of the bus. And the story is, you know about her, but an electrician wanted to buy a bus to store his electrical supplies, and he had big wooden wheels with the electrical stuff around him. So he went to an auction at a bus company, and he bid on a bus when they were auctioning them off, and he got one, I think, $200. Brought it back to his farm, stored his electrical supplies in there, all those wooden wheel wells and other supplies. Years later, 20-some odd years later, I got the article someplace, it was about 20 years later, somebody knocked on his door and said, "We think you have the bus." It must have been 40 years later. "We think you bought the bus that Rosa Parks sat on and wouldn't give up her seat." Well, you know, I bought a bus, it's out in the farm, boom, boom. They went out and they checked the route on top, they checked the maintenance numbers, all the serial numbers and everything, and they go, "That's the bus. That's the bus that Rosa Parks rode on." And I think, if I had my figures right, he bought it for $200, and I think he sold it for $2.5 million. And it's in the Ford Museum in Dearborn, Michigan. I've been to the museum, but it wasn't there then. When I was there back in the mid-90s. But it's been totally restored, and now it's worth something like $5 million. The bus that Rosa Parks was at. So, I was good on time. Did you have any comments or questions on first ladies or presidents? Did you ever see your first lady? Did you ever meet one or hear a presidential candidate speak or anything? Yes.
Eleanor Roosevelt came to the University of Illinois to speak for John Kennedy
Oh,
in
okay.
1960, and my professor said, "Everybody has to go." Quit class
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
stood in a small room to hear her speak.
She spoke all over, and I had a woman in one of these things who just a few weeks ago, she was singing in I call it the high school orchestra when Mrs. Roosevelt was there speaking. And the book I read says Mrs. Roosevelt went to a high school every Friday. She went to some other high school. She was first lady for about 14 years. So you can imagine how many high schools she went to. Very, very admired.
During World War II, when my mom was from Poughkeepsie,
Okay.
and, she used to go down to Poughkeepsie train station to wait for my dad to come home from furlough or wherever he was.
Yeah.
And she said one day she was sitting there, and she's looking around the station, and there were some men standing around in the corners, just kind of standing.
Mm-hmm.
And then she noticed over in the other corner, there sat Eleanor reading a book. They were waiting for
Yeah.
Franklin to come home for Hyde Park.
Oh,
Hyde
okay.
Park.
All right.
They were Secret
Yeah.
Service men, obviously.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd met a few people and things like this who had Eleanor Roosevelt go speak at their schools. And I met a woman, I think in Loretto, who said she got a kiss on the forehead by FDR. Yeah, yeah, that's going to be exciting. Yeah, and I met a woman who, she's our age, and when she was 17 or something, she lived in New Hampshire, and her parents says, "You got to go to volunteer tomorrow night, boom, 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 you got to help out." So they brought her to this event. She had to put on an apron, and she had to hand out things as people were walking in the door. So the event was going to be starting in 10 minutes. So they took the girls back stage, I'll call it, to meet the people that the person that she was volunteering for. She didn't know she was 17. And she met John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Ted Kennedy. There was a New Hampshire primary in 1960. But it's got to be a memory to carry on for the other rest of your life. This is an original program from Abe Lincoln's funeral. The songs are on the back that they sang, and his picture and stuff's on the front, and there are pages inside, so if you want to pick up that and look at it. One other thing I'll close, well, I'll close when you want to close it. Eli Stevenson ran against Dwight Eisenhower. He was speaking in Pennsylvania. He was up on a stage, and the photographer took a picture of a hole in his shoe. So, don't say, yeah, because you're dating yourself. So, Eisenhower's campaign had bumper stickers, billboards, and buttons saying, do you want this to happen to you? Do you want this to be president of the United States? I mean, a whole issue. So Stevenson says, I'm just like every other man in the country. I work hard. I walk every day. I walk hard campaigning. And I can't afford a new pair of shoes. So what I do when my soles wear out, I go to, where did men go in the 50s and 60s to get their shoes? They went to a shoemaker, a shoe repair. So he said, I gotta go to a shoe repair, just like every other hardworking man, and get a new pair of soles, sewed on my shoes. So that was one of the campaign cute issues back in the 50s. One other thing, someone talked to me before I was starting on the duels they used to have. We were talking, what was the man's name? Who was in the shooting? Well, anyway, just last month I came home from Florida, and on our way we stopped in Savannah, Georgia for a day. And they have what is a football field filled with men who got killed in duels. And what they did, it's really shaped like a football field. And you get in a duel, if you got shot and killed, they dug a hole and they put you right in the grave. So the whole field there is filled with bodies. Some have markers on them, some of them don't. But that's in Savannah, Georgia. We went on a bus tour and they showed us that on the bus tour. We also saw the bench that Forrest Gump sat on. We saw that.
Where my son lives in Maine, their church was visited before Kennedy was president. He pulled his yacht into Booth Bay Harbor and went to church, and the church where, it's a beautiful church too.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a plaque where he sat,
Oh,
like on the pew where he sat.
yeah. Okay. Very nice, very nice. One thing I forgot to mention, we were talking about Howdy Doody. Remember Clarabelle?
Yes.
Someone told me that Clarabelle became Captain
Yes.
Kangaroo.
Yes.
I wasn't aware of that. Yeah. He didn't say anything then. He just squeaked
His
something.
horn.
Squeaked his horn or something. Yeah. See, you didn't have to volunteer. They give you better than that.
Yeah, in fact, let me thank you because Howdy Doody was one of my heroes when I was very young. I'm dating myself here.
Yeah.
And my family, I thought, was a little slow about getting a TV set, maybe by about 2 years.
Yeah.
But my aunt and uncle got one. And so their sons, my cousins, they had Howdy Doody, and they could
Okay.
watch. So I would spend a lot of time at their house, and we'd be having fun. But boy, when it came time to watch Howdy Doody, we're in the house, we're in front of the TV set.
Yeah.
And another one that, at least in the Chicago area, was very popular was Kukla, Fran, and
Oh,
Ollie.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've read since that it was unscripted. And so these people were doing all these clever things they were doing without a script.
Yeah. Okay, I can go longer. It's up to you two. Anybody have any other questions or comments or anything you want to offer? Feel free to come up and look at everything. I have pictures of all the first ladies. I I have some articles on them. Again, I have this thing from FDR's funeral. You're welcome to look at. There's pictures here of people standing in line to go meet the presidents. And the first presidential car. And the chair that Teddy Roosevelt sat in when he was on trial in Syracuse. It's still preserved in the courthouse here, downtown Syracuse. The chair is still there. And actually, I wrote this article, and it's in a national magazine about the 100th anniversary of the day that Teddy Roosevelt sat in the chair. So you're welcome to look it up on it.
Thank you so much. And this is a great opportunity, folks, so don't pass it up. And as usual, we have wonderful refreshments, chance to talk, enjoy yourself, and certainly take a look at these incredible things.
We had one more question over here on the bench. Janet, I think, had a question.
Jan?
What, me?
Oh,
A friend of ours, Ron Hugh, was in charge of helping, take care of the president at one of his speeches. He was a police sergeant, and at first, President Ford walked past all of the sergeants and the policemen, and then he turned around and came back and shook hands with them all. And he always thought that was really nice that, he bothered to come back. So,
Yeah.
I guess I would mention.
Why don't you tell them what you wore when we went out to see Gerald Ford at the airport? She was in her nightgown when we went out to see Gerald Ford. So we went out to the airport when Gerald Ford came.
In my nightgown was out home. He said, "Come on, we gotta go, we're gonna miss the plane." And so,
Any more secrets you want to make up?